Hello and welcome to today's Industry Week webinar, Scaling Success Stories, Mastering Multi-Site Technology Deployments for Manufacturing Excellence, sponsored by Tulip. I'm Jill Jusko and I'm Executive Editor of Industry Week. Now I'd like to welcome our speakers today. Joining us are Brian McGarvey, Global Account Manager for Tulip. In his role, Brian partners with customer stakeholders to enable adoption of Tulip at enterprise scale, maximize value creation from the Tulip platform, and ensure overall customer success. And joining Brian, we have Brian Hasselton, Solutions Lead for Tulip. In his role, Brian assists customers through their deployments of Tulip, providing solution architecture and app building best practices. He also works with on-site personnel, helping them manage their current applications and develop novel solutions post-deployment. And with that, welcome to you both. And Brian, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jill. Hey, we're really excited to speak with everyone today. Thank you for joining. So for the agenda for today, we really have three sections. The first is going to be a brief overview of challenges of scaling tech deployments in manufacturing from our perspective and what we've seen with customers. Another section around enabling transformation at scale, and then also some lessons from the trenches or putting principles into practice from lessons learned and best practices from real deployments of customers that we've worked on or worked with. So to get started, we just want to do a very brief poll, and our moderators will send this out, but really we want to understand what reflects your scenario and where you are in your journey. So kind of the first section here, first A is really, your proof of value, right? Maybe you've conducted a POV at a site. It's been very successful, but you're trying to understand how you may scale that or you're trying to figure out how you're going to scale that within a site. Second is you've already had a very successful POV within a site, and you're scaling that at digital transformation scale at a single site. And then C is multi-site expansion. So you've done a very successful digital transformation at a site, and you're trying to scale that across your enterprise. So the overwhelming majority coming in is around 70% is kind of at that proof of value. So you may be conducting your first POV and beginning to understand the value of digital transformation solutions. There's a few that are kind of in that single site scaling or multi-site scaling, but yeah, the overwhelming majority, around 60% now, is kind of at that POV stage. Perfect. All right, so let's get going. So challenges of scaling tech deployments in manufacturing. So there's a lot of external factors driving need for change. These aren't novel, these aren't new, but kind of some of the big levers that we see driving the need for change is reshoring, just the amount of money and the need for new manufacturing spend with reshoring over recent years. The supply chain disruptions, everything from during COVID and the aftermath after COVID, and the volatility and shortages within the supply chain, and then also labor shortages. So hiring and retaining the right talent for your enterprise is we see these as kind of the big three levers, which are helping drive the need for or the want to embark on a digital transformation journey. But when we talk about kind of where do we start, where are we starting when we say digital transformation journey? When we engage with customers, typically what we see is something like this. There's a human at the center that has a lot of processes that are running. So a lot of it's paper-based, a lot of it's manual. So hopefully this resonates with a lot of you on the call in terms of in some way, right? Because this is typically what we see when we first engage with customers, where there's a lot of paper-based processes. It's a lot of manual, am I running out of parts? Don't forget this one, don't forget the rubber stamp to, sign of approval on this piece of paper. Triple check the labels, always keep the papers. And if it's going to go off into a filing cabinet somewhere for reference, maybe later. Manually entering jobs in the ERP, double checking every row into Excel. And then, just these very manual processes, but the theme is like the humans at the center. This is usually the starting point, and there's some expectation to scale digital solutions within a site or within multiple sites. And that expectation, at least for a lot of people, is somewhere on the left, right? Like digital transformation is going to be this fully autonomous, super slick, autonomous line. But in reality, humans are likely, our point of view is humans are likely going to remain at the center of your operations. And digital transformation is going to help augment their capabilities and their lived reality. And so something on the right is what we see as like the attainable and transformative reality of digital transformation. So there's a lot of challenges with scaling tech deployments. And again, this is non-exhaustive, but this is kind of the distillation of what we see as like just some of the major pain points that we see with scaling tech deployments, and usually starts with a lack of alignment. So organizations are not sharing that holistic strategy and vision for why they're even going down a digital transformation journey, or why and how they're going to adopt a technology. Oftentimes, there's also analysis or paralysis by analysis. So over-engineering or over-planning that leads to inaction, and not just getting started and iterating. So a lot of it's the upfront planning that's over-burdensome to actually achieving value, and it's not quick iterations and value capture. It's quick iterations, value capture on the order of days or weeks. It's these huge monolithic endeavors that go months and years before you start yielding results. There's also IT and OT tensions. We see this all the time, where it's usually clashing priorities and also conflicting, turf wars in terms of who's controlling what. And oftentimes we see that, it takes a while for organizations to kind of sort this out and get everybody rowing in the same direction. I'm sure this is probably resonates with many of you, but also inconsistent environments, especially across complex enterprises where there's been acquisitions. You're in different countries, you're in different countries, different business units. There's different disparate processes, different systems, different versions of your ERP, and the efforts to harmonize that, take years, different cultures from one site to another, and just overall is different processes. So that's usually a very big challenge. And then there's also something that we see all the time around technical acumen and readiness. So, traditional manufacturers, a site and some of its leaders may have been doing the same thing for 30 years, right? And so their technical acumen and readiness to adopt change and digital solutions may not be there. And that's okay, because you just have to understand that there might be a little bit of a learning curve, but there definitely is, you definitely have to ask the right questions in terms of, are the right tools in place? Are you culturally ready to adopt a transformational technology at scale? Again, non-exhaustive, but these are some of the stumbling blocks that we see on the road to scale. And we just want to share those, and we'll dive into, I think, each one of these kind of touch on these later on in the presentation, but wanted to kind of seed these in everyone's mind. So something that we see often is, scaling too early before you've developed a clear strategy and adoption program. Another one is not having a lack of buy-in from people across your organization. So, typically we see that, hey, a single site has proven value and done really well, but then being able to sell that internally and get buy-in from operators, IT, and other stakeholders across your network is something that we see customers typically stumble on. Also, too centralized. So sometimes digital transformation efforts come solely from a top-down perspective, and trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and forcing this upon sites and forcing this upon the people who live the reality within the four walls of your manufacturing plant, instead of empowering developers across the sites who are closest to the operations and know the problems. We also see another stumbling block around missed opportunities to compile learnings and best practices and to share those across your network. So, basically meaning that you don't start from square one each time you go to a new site. And then also the wrong tech can lead to implementing systems or platforms that don't scale long term. And so you have to be thinking about the future. Your operations are going to change. Your environment is going to change. So having the right technology that can adapt with you and help you future-proof for the unknowns that you obviously don't know today. Having the right technology stack and platforms and tools to allow you to adapt to the challenges of tomorrow. So hitting the main message here is that without the right vision and plan, organizations typically fail because and fail to scale despite implementing best-in-class technology. It's so important to make sure that you have the right strategy and organizational readiness before you scale. So with this, I'll hand it over to Brian to discuss enabling transformation at scale.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And based on that last point that Brian made, I want to talk a lot about what that plan is, what that vision looks like. So we do have a bit of a blueprint in terms of what digital transformation foundationally looks like, and what is the blueprint for that multi-site success. So a few things to talk through here. This first piece is strategy and objectives, right? How are we going to lay the groundwork for all of our sites? How are we going to approach that? What are the right personnel involved within these decisions? Who are we bringing along for our journey? The second piece is the adoption program. This is really, what does our central team look like? How are we going to deliver value to individual sites across the organization or across the firm? Third is program management. How are we going to show value from each of these deployments, enabling best practices, gathering any information that we've gotten from those previous sites, adapting and growing that program over time? And the final one is ensuring governance. And again, we're going to talk about all of these in just a second. Ensuring governance, right? What best practices do we have? What kind of data structures do we have? How are we going to integrate to other systems, et cetera, et cetera? So what kind of rules do we have, and what kind of constraints are we working in? So let's start here with strategy and objectives. So ultimately, what is our purpose, right? What is the size of the prize in terms of, you're going to begin digital transformation, but what does that really mean, right? So as far as the business side goes, what is the value that we're getting out of a digital transformation tool or a digital transformation shift? So how are we doing that? And also, how are we going to structure that? What is our operating model in terms of what kind of people are we having? Who are we bringing along for this ride? The org structure, again, what roles and responsibilities do we have? And how are we going to learn from each of these individual sites and then execute in the future? So a few questions that we can ask ourselves to better help us through this portion. And I've touched on some of these already, but as far as the business side, again, what is the value in terms of actually doing this digital transformation? Let's say we're successful. What does this mean for us? Operations, what kind of data are we going to get? And how are we going to structure that data as well, right? What KPIs do we care about? How are we getting to them? And how are we going to continue to deliver that value back up to a central team or an executive team that wants that information? The organizational model, who is delivering on this? How are we delivering that value? How are we going from site to site and implementing those solutions? So this touches on a little bit of that personnel, right? Who are we bringing alongside for our journey here? So the executives, how are we going to make this make sense? How are we going to make this competitive for us? How does digital transformation help us in these goals? And what information can we serve back to the executive team, show, hey, site 1 or site 2 improved by 40% in these areas? Engineering, right? We need people on the floor, people at the site, in order to say, these are the problems that I have, these are the pains that I experience. I want tools to be able to solve these things, and I need new tools to get that value. IT, really key player, as Brian mentioned earlier, right? We need IT in order to make sure that we're compliant with data security. How are we making sure that those best practices are in place from an IT standpoint? IT is going to be involved once you get to the multi-site scale, so it's better to bring them along, make sure that they're a player that's involved and bought in to this journey as well. And also quality, right? How are we going to maintain the control of this system? Any regulated processes that we have, any critical processes? What does quality look like for here as well?
Yeah, Brian, before you move on, I just want to emphasize a point here is that like the purpose and vision, and also dubbed as like the strategy objectives, is so critical between moving from that single site deployment to the multi-site. Because it's not easy, but people can usually execute a single site, deployment. But once you do that, then you're trying to go across different business units, across different cultures, across different languages. Especially in high enterprise complexity, it becomes very hairy, and you need to have that strong signal for why our company and why our enterprise is going to go down this journey. If you were able to define that and have that vision defined and communicated from executives and senior leadership down, then it helps align the different sites to buy into the efforts.
Yeah, really great point, Brian. definitely agreed with all of that. So moving on to the next piece here is the adoption program itself, right? And one key point that I want to make here is we call this an adoption program rather than a center of excellence, because there are a lot of things that we do deploy, right? We deploy solutions, we might deploy people to sites, we deploy software, but really when it comes to digital transformation, we can't just deploy that, we have to adopt it, right? This is a cultural shift, it's a technological shift, it's something that needs to be a little bit more long-term. So we need to make sure that we have buy-in from the stakeholders at those facilities in order to execute this enterprise level adoption. And what that really means to us is, what roles and responsibilities do we have within this adoption program? How are we delivering these solutions? How are we making sure that, you don't deploy something and 6 months later, a year later, that's no longer really being used by the site because maybe they had some changes, maybe they needed something different. So we want to remain agile and stay with them. And that's really what this adoption program is here for. So moving to a couple of different models of what this adoption program or center of excellence, whichever you'd like to call it, might look like for different facilities. So I'm going to talk about the two on the outside first, and then talk about the benefits of something that's more center-led. So on the decentralized side, we have sites that are sort of left up to not only their own devices, but they have a little bit more freedom in terms of they are developing either solutions or deploying things on their own as they see fit, which certainly makes sense on some of these smaller deployments. And to Brian's earlier point, when you go to one site, it might be pretty easy to get that across. You have one culture that you're working in, but now we have multiple sites and we might share best practices, but we also want to make sure that we're not too decentralized here. On the other side of that spectrum, where we get into more of the IT constraints and centralized top-down pushes, we get a lot of that information coming from the top, right? So best practices and standards are being pushed from the top down. Sites have some degree of say, but ultimately it's really that centralization team that's pushing these onto the sites. Now, on the middle of that and sort of the democratization of building digital transformation looks a little bit more center-led, right? We still have a central team. We're getting best practices. We're iterating from all of the learnings that we have from previous sites, and we're deploying those individuals and those solutions to individual sites and working with the local implementation teams. But ultimately, we have a little bit more buy-in from both sides, right? We're enabling that bottom up from decentralization, and we're also allowing the constraints to come in from that centralized methodology as well.
Yeah, Brian, before we move on, just one other thing to add is one thing that I've certainly taken away from being able to work with some of our larger customers who are trying to undergo multi-site scale of, at least of our solution, Tulip, is that their operating model, their adoption program, it's not one size fits all. It's like very dependent on the capabilities and the culture within the organization. And so something that I truly enjoy working on is helping them figuring out and iterate on what does this adoption program look like in the context of that company. And it evolves over time too, because you may not go after every site at once. Maybe it's your North American site, maybe it's a business unit, maybe it is every site across your enterprise. But the context is very dependent. It's something that we love working on and providing a perspective too, because once you kind of dive into, okay, what's the next layer on here? It gets a little bit more nuanced, but it's absolutely doable. And it does depend on the culture of each individual company.
Yeah, really great point, Brian. And again, I think we've touched on some of these points, but the adoption program is really there to build citizen developers, show what's possible, take those best practices and instill them into the site, again, with those proper guardrails, controls, everything else that we get from that central team, and also share those best practices, right? If we have solutions that have already been built that might apply, let's absolutely have them at the next site. So that brings us to program management. And program management is also really important to take all of the lessons from the adoption program and instill that into our central team, right? So any best practices that we got from that last site that we just did, evaluating, were we successful at this deployment? Did we have, cultural shifts at this particular site? Did we try to fit the square peg into the round hole, so to speak? Is there anything else that we need to evaluate on and grow for? And also, what was the value of that last site that we performed digital transformation at, right? What is the ROI for that facility? How much did they improve? Are we able to track all of that information? We want to make sure that we have that value capture enabled as well.
Yeah, and again, just to interject really quickly, in my experience, this program management piece is typically something that is kind of lacking as companies transition from, hey, we successfully did one site, 2 sites, to, hey, we want to go do enterprise transformation. It's really the tactics of being able to execute this and engage with sites, engage with stakeholders, and make sure and keep everything on track. But as Brian also mentioned, that value capture, improvement tracking, it's so important to have that as part of that program and project management cadence, so that you feed that fuel back into the business and say, look what we're doing. This is how we're capturing it, and we're transforming the business in a meaningful way.
Yeah, totally agreed. And maybe one other point to that as well is identifying which sites might be ready for digital transformation as well, right? So prioritizing which sites we're going to, which order we might go to them in, all things that are important for program management.
Yep.
So this is a slide that I personally like a lot as well. And what we're sort of looking at is what that adoption program paired with program management can look like. And this unified organizational vision on this side here that we're looking at might be adopted from all of the information that we've collected from other sites, or maybe just the first site that you've performed. And the idea here is, instead of following, say, waterfall methodology that might be a little bit more traditional in terms of we go through scoping, and then we go through design, and then user requirements, and then we talk about development, and then we go through user testing, and it might be 6 months, a year plus before we actually have anything on the floor, anything in the hands of the user. And in those cases, what happens if we have something that we didn't catch, something that's unknown? We might just have to go back in and change those things anyway, even though we've been waiting for 6 months to a year. So instead of going through that approach, we start small with a pilot, say 1 line, 1 station, 1 area, something small. We might have some unknowns, but that's okay. We're going to deploy something, get feedback from the people who are using this every day, understand, hey, what's actually happening on the floor? What's actually happening in these processes? Do we need to iterate on this? And ideally iterate very quickly, right? And before we know it, we can scale that to multiple stations or multiple lines or multiple use cases across the floor because, hey, we saw some value in this in the first place. And that speaks to what we now see on the right side, right? We have our knowns, we have our unknowns, but ultimately we're able to tackle all of these things that actually impact and drive value within the site without waiting too long. And that's really our goal here, is to be agile, to move quickly, have those underlying centralized data model, microservices, whatever systems you might be connecting to in the background. But ultimately, we're deploying many solutions, many different forms of value here. And
to add on, with the previous slide, in terms of that initial engagement with sites, it's so important to build momentum. And that's why we've seen so many enterprise multi-site deployments for technology fail, is because, it's those 6-month, 8-month, 14-month lead times before anything's actually on the floor. You've lost so much momentum. And that's why we believe, at least from a solution like Tulip, where you can take this iterative approach, deploy solutions rapidly, you're able to gain that momentum, and it gets the site excited, and it helps drive that. As Brian mentioned, it's not just digital transformation's sake. It's a cultural shift where people understand that they're empowered to go solve problems, the knowns and the unknowns, and it's awesome to see. Another important point to make here is this left-hand side with that unified organizational vision. Again, keeping this in the context of a multi-site deployment, right? if you're going from that single site and then you want to proliferate, part of that adoption program and what they're doing is they're helping synthesize that unified organizational vision and taking those best practices, those in the context of Tulip, the best applications, and making those available for the next sites, right? And it's a wave of sites. So it's not site 1, site 2, site 3, site 4. It's maybe site 1, then 2 additional sites, and 4, then 6, then 10. And you're taking the best practice and feeding that in a virtuous loop into your other deployments so that they're scaling faster, getting value more quickly. And so again, just kind of that different approach that you can take, we think is like fundamental to why, like how to scale effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And here's one other piece of what that program planning can look like is tiering the sites by their maturity. And this is just an example of what a framework might look like, directional in nature here. But starting from the left side, they're aware of digital solutions, digital transformation. They're starting to think about some of those things. And again, this is something to match our sites to. So with each individual site, they might have a score in terms of where they stand within this framework. And M1, shifting to that, gets into, okay, now we're piloting, we're starting with something, we're starting with that unified organizational vision, we're maybe piloting on a line, starting to see what digital transformation might look like for this particular site. And now M2 shifts into sort of this last slide that we're looking at where we have knowns, we have unknowns, but ultimately we have items deployed and we're iterating on them. And we're starting to think about what does this look like in other areas? What does this look like within my entire facility? What does this look like as something like an ecosystem? Maybe I'm tying in other systems now. Maybe I'm bringing my ERP in, other data that I might be getting from my machines. I'm thinking about this in a little bit more of a complex way now, where I have many different things talking to each other. And then M3, really sort of the final mile here in terms of transformation. And we're starting to think about, how do we bring this to other facilities? How do we finalize the improvement? How do we, make sure that all of our solutions are up to current date and time where we imagine them to be? How is this ecosystem sort of finalizing? And then moving on to governance. So we sort of see, this kind of tug of war, so to speak, of IT wanting to control certain things in systems of record and standardize some of those processes, whereas engineering and operations, they just want to solve problems. They want the tools to solve those problems. They know what the pains are. And realistically, we can have both here, right? We want to have a system where both of these parties are satisfied. We want to make sure that we pull in the controls piece from IT, and we want to make sure that we're solving the right problems with the engineers and with operations. So this applies to all types of things like data security and compliance. What kind of data are we collecting? Where are we collecting that data? We want to avoid things like data duplication. We want to make sure everything is living in the source of truth. And again, this varies site to site or by customer to customer rather. And moving on to other things like connections to external systems. What is the right way to do that? We want to make sure that we're secure in pulling data from our ERP into another solution or into another software. How are we managing users? How are we iterating on app content like we talked about earlier, right? What's the right way to version those applications, to approve those applications, make sure that we're not just pushing something out that maybe isn't finished. We want to make sure that there's some level of sign-off there. And again, how are we locking down that data in a way that we need to? So this is another view of sort of what we talked about earlier with the various ways of centralization and decentralization, with democratization somewhere in the middle there, where on the left side, we have something where maybe engineering is doing a lot of this work and centralization is over on the right side where they're implementing a lot of controls, and that pendulum can swing back somewhere into the middle where we have value coming from both sides and everybody sort of in harmony there. And one last point on governance that we want to call out is that managing the platform instead of the individual solutions, in a case like Tulip, we think about that as applications, but ultimately, we like to think about this as an analog to something like Excel, right? You don't manage every single sheet in Excel. You manage Excel as a platform, and you allow people to use the sheets in a way that is compliant within your organization. And we think about that sort of the same way for solutions and applications in our case. And finally, putting all of everything that I just talked about together is, what does this journey sort of look like when we have all 4 of these pieces coming together? And here we have step 1 is we want to generate a list of focus sites, right? So program management identifies a number of sites that make the most sense to start our digital transformation journey in. Maybe they have the most to gain. Maybe they're the most culturally ready, culturally fit for these solutions. And then we say, okay, where are we going to start? And who's going to take lead? Who from the adoption program is going to potentially go to the site or work with the site in order to identify all of those items that they might have? Moving on to actual site deployment now. With that identified site, we select key use cases, understand what pain points that facility might have, how digital transformation can help them. Then we start to solve those problems, develop applications. And again, that's going back to that previous slide of, you have many knowns, you have many unknowns, but ultimately you have a number of solutions that are deployed to the floor. And then we start to expand within operations, going to multiple areas, going to multiple lines, starting to see what that looks like in terms of an ecosystem. And then we can rinse and repeat. And we go site by site. And to Brian's point, this isn't, site 1, then site 2, then site 3. This might be site 1, and then 3 sites, and then 6 sites, and then 10 sites, 20 sites, as we get those additional learnings from each of those sites and start to understand, how are we deploying? We're starting to really understand what use cases we have. We've seen these use cases before. Maybe we have standard content on those use cases and really start to deploy there. And I'll hand this back over to Brian to talk a little bit more about putting these into practice and what we've seen in the past.
So yeah, this section's all about taking a couple learnings and successes and lessons learned from some of our customers that we wanted to share with you all. And so understanding the context of this is multi-site, mastering multi-site scaling and deployments. But we also wanted to acknowledge, though, that you don't get there on day one, right? And I think this is especially important because we anticipated that most people would be kind of at that in that question A, right? And that's where most people were, is like, hey, we're thinking about a POV, or we're kind of in a single site, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we kind of covered across like successes, the learnings, the advice for both the customer and our own thinking as well around that journey of between POV to a single site and single site to a few sites and a few sites to dozens, right? So for our first example, of going from kind of this successful POV to a single site digital transformation, wanted to share just and highlight one of our customers who's a medical device manufacturer, and they were going from kind of an R&D scaling up production from a few units built per month to hundreds of units, so full on production. And they needed to figure out how to do that with a digital solution, and they wanted a next gen manufacturing solution. And so what they did was they were able to build a next generation MES in Tulip at a third of the cost from traditional providers. About 6 months, they have 90 plus apps in production, and have had great success. So distilling some of the best practices that we saw from them, and I think that they would also and have explained, is that it's really important to create those small pilots that lead to a large impact. Because again, as we discussed earlier in the presentation, is that kind of is the fuel, the rocket fuel to keep and enable broader buy-in from other stakeholders within the business to show like, hey, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we can do it quickly and impactfully. Something that they've said is, in their approach was start slow to run fast. And that doesn't mean, analysis, paralysis by analysis or just wait. What that means is having, at least some deliberate upfront planning, which enabled them to scale rapidly down the road. So that doesn't mean that they they didn't deploy, they didn't test and iterate, but they did take a breath of, they did take a pause and say, okay, like what are we trying to accomplish, and how are we going to do it? And just having some forethought allowed them to accelerate their deployment. Something else that they highlighted was that they were able to shift to an agile project management and development process. So implementing agile Scrum as opposed to maybe a traditional waterfall methodology. So again, that's kind of that cultural shift, which goes into the next bullet point here around a cultural shift in terms of how do you deploy these solutions, how, it's a culture, it's a continuous improvement mindset as opposed to maybe a traditional deployment process. This fourth bullet is, around, I think something that they're going to paraphrase here, but, when they went down this journey, I think, a lot of operators, a lot of people on the shop floor may be nervous around like, hey, how is this going to impact my job? Am I going to have a job next, tomorrow, or 6 months from now? Like, are you guys going to, am I going to be, you're going to become so efficient that, you're not needed. But really what, I think, again, paraphrasing here is what they focused on was empowering and training staff to transform the way that they work. As opposed to saying, hey, we're going to implement, technology so you're no longer needed. It's no, we're going to make it so you are more empowered to do your job better and deliver more value to our business. A few lessons learned. Again, I think they reiterated this is like, analysis by paralysis, don't get stuck. And then something more of a quote is if you don't start, you'll never learn. So again, following our best practices of, pilots, iterate, not have to over-engineer everything, get things on the shop floor, get feedback from operators, be able to, make them understand that you're willing to understand their pain points, and they'll come to you with the real problems. Like they'll uncover and, shine a light in the dusty corner to show you how you can actually transform your operations. It's pretty awesome to see when this happens. And then they also make the point around focusing on scalable processes with the right governance. So again, just Brian had touched on that in the previous section. It's so important to kind of have those left and right guardrails established kind of earlier on in the process in the deployments. So that when you do scale, kind of the swim lane you're supposed to be going down. So this next example is kind of illustrating the single site to a handful of site deployment. And this was a renewable energy storage manufacturer. Again, they began kind of more of an R&D engineering focused company and transitioned to a kind of more of a production manufacturing with the multi-site deployment. Their solution is they ultimately implemented Tulip, so a modern no-code operations platform that targeted specific use cases across multiple sites. Scaled to, I believe it's up to 3 facilities now, and again, so that handful of sites coming kind of from one, and kind of having that visibility and data capture to see what's actually happening in their operations. So some best practices we heard from them or from their deployment was, an adoption program was very powerful because it helped empower operators to solve the highest priority problems. They were able to identify the valuable problems early on. So again, that rapid, quick wins early to establish momentum, the rocket fuel to feeding that into your leadership to make sure that they understand the value that you're bringing and delivering. And they also had a pretty methodical approach to building value and scaling that internally for long-term success. Something else that I think they were pretty pragmatic early on in terms of making sure that they were adopting a technology, a platform that helped ensure that they were future-proofing for the unknowns, right? Your problems today probably aren't going to be your problems tomorrow. Some of them may well be, but you don't know what you don't know, and your operations are absolutely going to change. So you need to make sure you have a tech stack that is able to be flexible enough to adapt and be agile to your problems of tomorrow. Some advice, lessons learned, kind of freeing up on the development side. So we said, like, hey, at least in the context of Tulip, this empowers engineers, quality leads, people on the front line to be creative, develop solutions that help solve problems and deliver value. And so that's great, but being able to also lock down on the deployment side through governance. So just because somebody has a great idea and they're able to test it out doesn't mean it actually ends up on the shop floor. And that's a really important point to make, that there is those governance kind of milestones and checkpoints to make sure that it's not just the Wild West and people can deploy whatever they want to your operations. Again, they reemphasizing the importance of having a high-level plan for implementing an expansion or transformation. So again, tying back to that objectives and strategy. Also establishing that relationship with IT and OT, so bringing them into the fold to be a part of the process, as opposed to trying to keep them at completely arm's length. Things go much more smoothly, especially once you start trying to scale and become an enterprise solution when you have IT as a partner as opposed to opposition. And also, there's also going to be a kind of a tipping point, not just with this customer, but many others, where there's like this critical mass of people start to realize how valuable and powerful, digital transformation tools and technologies can be. And so there's like a ton of requests that come out of the woodwork because they're like, I need this solved and I know I can get it solved. But then it becomes like, okay, how do I prioritize, these efforts versus those efforts? And that's where, that project and program management function comes in to help kind of make sure that you're staying in pace with like the tactics and the vision of your organization. The last example here is kind of this multi-site expansion. So we're now talking, we went from a couple sites, five-ish sites. Now we're scaling to tens, dozens of sites across a complex global network. And so really, large enterprise customer, it's, many disparate systems, but it's very also like it's also not uncommon to see that, hey, you just have general limited visibility into production performance tracking on production lines, machines, disparate systems, different processes. And they really wanted a platform that allowed them to start jumpstarting their digital transformation journey, being able to start with pilots, enable citizen developers to solve problems, and build a center of excellence that they can use to scale. And so, over 40 sites and still growing with a center of excellence that helps establish this governance. And so some of the best practices, again, lessons learned, before we get into the questions here, are, that adoption program or COE to standardize the best apps and scale apps and make them available to every site has helped accelerate deployments to other sites. So it's not you're not starting at ground zero or at the bottom, the bottom floor for every site. You're already taking lessons learned, and you're able to implement that and get momentum even faster and scale faster. Going back to the importance of IT partnership is so bringing in our IT to be an internal partner as opposed to an adversary, and making them part of the development process, especially when you get to like business critical systems, right? So things that are connecting to your ERP or data lakes, right? Or machines or edge devices, right? There's a lot more involvement that's required from a governance standpoint, making sure that things are secure and kind of being methodical about it. So it definitely is important to have IT as a part of the conversation. There's also something that they've been working on. I think it's great is, a common data architecture and cohesive data capture framework. So when you go to sites, I don't know if you remember like that slide where it was like the iterative like sideways triangle with like the little building blocks of apps. That left-hand gray side was like that unified vision. And so like those are the types of things that you can go to each site and say, hey, we are trying to accomplish these goals. We want these KPIs. We want these objectives for each site, knowing that the sites are going to have many other problems that are unique to them and they can go solve those. But at least having like that first foundational understanding of like, this is what we're tackling first. And this is how we're going to do it from a data architecture and capture standpoint has been very great, as well as this site maturity framework. Again, large, complex enterprise customer. There's a wide array of the maturity of different sites in terms of where they are on their maturity framework. So they established one and they actually kind of scope that out and put everyone on the map to say like, hey, these are the types of sites, these are the business units, these is their maturity across their self-made maturity curve. So it helps allow them to understand how do we engage the sites. And I think what they'll say, one of the terms they say is like meet the sites where they are, because not every site is the same from a maturity standpoint. Some lessons learned and advice that I think we would share is, it's again, just reiterating the importance of having a strong digital transformation vision and strategy that can get site level stakeholders to take action on and excited. Is super important because, as you go from site to site, it's almost a relearning process of like engaging a site, the general manager and their leadership. even though it might be a goal of the company, you still have to kind of go through this learning process. And so at least having a clear vision and strategy helps kind of ease the pain there. Again, this probably, I would imagine, resonates with, or is probably a lot of people on the call problem right now, is rogue systems across, multiple sites, right? The access database that somebody built, 15 years ago, and only one person knows the complexities and ins and outs of it, right? Random little MESs or, scripts that people have run or developed on a multitude of systems. Just random databases that are out there that some people may or may not know about. Like, being able to kind of take stock of all that and then have a platform to say, okay, we can bring this all under one roof and have visibility into it is pretty empowering. And then to wrap up here, again, just reemphasizing the point of empowering operators, engineers on the shop floor and being able to listen to them has been able to surface a ton of opportunities. And be able to surface a ton of opportunities that you normally wouldn't know about, because people would normally just not say anything. But when they understand that they have a tool that can help solve their problems, people start raising their hands a lot more frequently, and it unlocks value in pretty interesting ways. And to kind of wrap it all up here, just to hit home on the importance of as you go to sites and as you're planning, just kind of that first use case that shows business value is pretty critical to keep the momentum, to build and keep momentum. All right. So just as a quick summary before we get into the questions, just want to recap on some of the critical themes for today. So the early wins matter, right? That momentum building is extremely critical. But you also need that strong strategy and vision for the long game. So as you go and proliferate across your enterprise, you need to have that in place. Having a robust adoption program is a key enabler to making sure that you're able to effectively scale. It acts as an accelerant. And so you're not starting from the same, from the same bottom floor every time. You are starting from a new height each time that you scale. Plan early for the data. So having that forethought to say, okay, we're about ready to have data and the capability to get insights in a way that we have never had before. So making sure that you're able to communicate, know what you're trying to achieve, trying to go after, and be able to communicate that to the sites helps get them to have buy-ins. You can sell the picture, you can sell the vision of what they're going to get. It helps ease the pain of going to these sites and approaching them and saying, hey, this is why we're doing this. But it also helps you communicate the data and take action on insights that you're going to have. So it's a value of business value as well. And then we truly believe that agility and composability matter. So the square peg round hole mentality, what works at one site is not going to work for the others. Some might, and there's going to be some foundational amount of solutions that will, but lift and shift is usually not completely realistic. So being able to adapt to the nuances and complexities of each site, but then also being able to build and iterate on solutions for the future unknowns is extremely important. So with that, wanted to say thank you, and we will now turn it over to Jill for moderating some Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation. First question we have is from James, who asks, what people, for example, their roles, do you see that are early adopters? Are they operators, manufacturing engineers, leadership, C-level, or what?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a stab at this one first. So great question. Like all good things, it really depends. But I think in my experience, kind of the persona that starts leading the initiatives are directors of operations of business units, or sometimes a director of advanced manufacturing that kind of gets interested in taking stock of what are the tools out there that we might evaluate to bring into our operations. And then typically we bring in our professional services team then to start engaging with, various different ways to do this, but like a 90-day onboarding where very rapidly building and iterating solutions and teaching the people on the shop floor. So typically, I think this will answer your question, the manufacturing engineers, the quality engineers, those types of personas, to understand how to use Tulip. It's pretty awesome to see like people that will come in not knowing anything about Tulip, maybe take a few courses on Tulip University, have some guidance from our professional services team. It's really a train the trainer type of mentality, because by the end of these engagements, they are what we call citizen developers. They are off and running. They've built the solutions with the guidance of our professional services team. And so they have the foundation and framework to build, maintain, and own these solutions, and then also teach others within their site. And it's really, really, really awesome to see how excited that they get once they understand they have a tool that is very, very powerful for solving problems that they live every day. And then what's also great to see is the excitement of the operators that actually get to engage with the tool and the systems, because they now, when you do it right, and this happens, this is like I think one of the most powerful things is like you can literally go out to the operators that are interacting with, in our context, Tulip, and they may give somebody feedback and say, I wish I didn't have this step, or it would be really great to have another check here, or move this button, or remove the number of clicks here. And you can do that in a matter of minutes and then deploy it. And so when you can have that type of continuous improvement, then the operators become more engaged. And then it's like this whole site level cultural shift where everyone knows that they're now empowered to like actually make a difference and have the power to change things on the order of hours, days, weeks, as opposed to I got to put in an IT ticket and good luck. So it was a long answer to your early adopters, but I think it's a complex answer. So James, great question. I hope that answered it, and would love to follow up if you have any other questions.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for Brian McGarvey specifically. Brian, can you tell us more about how Tulip has done in different overseas markets? What countries have been receptive to Tulip services?
Yeah, great question. We are, I think, in every continent except for I think Antarctica at this point. I want to say in our Boston headquarters, we have this pretty awesome map of global operations where customer events are firing. So we're everywhere. And so I think to answer your question, is done very well with overseas markets and continuing to grow. For me, I know we have some of my customers are in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Singapore, Malaysia. We have customers in Australia. Like it is a globe, and that's like, kind of then obviously all of Europe and now in Middle East. So we have customers all over the place. It's been very receptive, or very, very receptive to like different cultures and different locations. So yeah, there's I guess a lot of success in overseas markets as well as just, being in the United States.
Okay, terrific. Our next question is this. How can I effectively pitch digital transformation efforts to my leadership? So
pitching digital transformation efforts to your leadership, I think one of the things that I think is most important is to understand, like, especially from what are the objectives of your company and the company and therefore the leadership. I think that there's an element where people get hung up around like, what's the tangible value? Like how many hours am I saving? How many people will I be able to cut? Like how much will I be able to improve throughput? And there's certainly a lot of like those very tangible, benefits. And so I think that's like probably like one portion of the equation. But then what I think is people struggle to communicate effectively are the intangibles, like data as a currency. We've seen customers that have effectively undergone digital transformation and their ability to control their own destiny because they are managing with insights like that and answering questions because they have access to data is in ways that you just could never even imagine when it's just based on paper. it's a competitive advantage. And so it takes a lot more, it's a lot harder to convey that type of transformation to your leadership, but would love to continue the conversation, because we've certainly helped customers do exactly that, convey that message, both on the tangible as well as the intangible side, or like not intangible, like a little bit less tangible.
Yeah, and I think that data piece is a really big key there, in terms of what data are we collecting and how fast are we able to actually see that, right? From the executive level, if I'm on my phone, I can see all of those dashboards in terms of data that I'm seeing at each line, at each of my facilities. Or if I'm a manager, I don't necessarily need to leave my office to see, hey, what's happening on cell 1, what's up, what's down, how many pieces am I producing? That visibility is really beneficial. And we see this even internal to sites. Once one area gets up and running, it starts to have those dashboards. Other areas start to sort of look to that area and say, well, this person has all this information, and now that I see that, well, I want it too. And it sort of creates an effect that, we start to really expand very quickly at that point.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian McGarvey, and thank you, Brian Hasselton, for your excellent presentation this afternoon. Also, I would like very much to thank our sponsor, Tulip. Most of all, of course, I'd like to thank our audience for their kind attention and their questions. And finally, on behalf of Industry Week, have a great, productive remainder of your day.